Okay, so this is your Project 2 lecture on Han China. So before we get into looking at the Han Dynasty, which was quite a bit into China's history, let's take a look at pre-classical China. China is a very old civilization, and complex civilizations have existed in this region for a long time. And so we want to take a look at the background before we dive into Han China itself. So our focus for this unit will start with the decline of the Zhou dynasty, which took place. The dynasty itself lasted from 1100 to 221 BCE, and the last stage there, the so-called Warring States period, was a product of the breakup of the Zhou dynasty and the breakup of China into these smaller competing states. And if you look at the map here in the lower right-hand column, you see the major states. We might call them kingdoms or regions that were competing during the Warring States period. And I want you to take a look at the small area just to the center left. That's the Qin region, and that will be very important in the lead up to the Han Dynasty. Now, during the breakdown of the Zhou dynasty and the Warring States period, I'm sorry, just a little bit before the Warring States period, we see the life of Confucius. And Confucius was responsible for the early development and codification of Confucianism as a spiritual and social edifice. So, what we mean by that is, Confucius organized this philosophy. So he wasn't so much a prophet like Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha. He was a collector of older cultural and spiritual traditions within China, and he kind of collected them and turned them into a more systematic approach. Now, the big characteristics of Confucianism are filial piety and ancestor worship, right? So piety is a sense of worshipfulness, and filial in this case being family, specifically parents and ancestors. And so Confucianism is all about respecting the older generation and the generations who've come before and now died. Not quite to the level of worship that we might think of in the Judeo-Christian sense, but a real sense of honoring and paying respect to the dead. Confucianism also sought to define roles within society, right? How are the peasants supposed to behave? How are the leaders supposed to behave? How is the emperor supposed to behave? How are men and women supposed to behave? And so all those roles were highly defined within Confucianism, and then Confucianism sought to give a sense of harmony between those roles. So that way society was highly organized, highly structured. Everybody knew what they were supposed to do and when they were supposed to do it. And this is, remains a characteristic of Confucianism and Chinese society more generally. Now, coming from this notion of Confucianism as this harmony between roles, political legitimacy in China after Confucianism was really based on this notion of the mandate of heaven. Now, as you recall from other lectures in this project, political legitimacy is, who gets to be in charge and how do we figure out who gets to be in charge? And for Confucianism, it was the mandate of heaven, right? A mandate is a command, is an order, right? So the emperor was emperor because heaven willed it, because heaven wanted it. And out of this sense of the mandate of heaven was the idea that dynasties, and remember a dynasty is the emperor and his children and his children's children, right? So a dynasty is a line of emperors or kings with the same line of parentage, usually the father. And so these dynasties would rise and fall as the dynasty gained the mandate of heaven and then lost the mandate of heaven. And so if you see this graphic here, you see this, it's like a mountain. It's a peak, right? The dynasty is founded and it grows and it obtains the mandate of heaven and becomes very powerful and honorable and virtuous. And then over time, later emperors start to fool around too much, waste money, become greedy, become disinterested in leading their people. And so gradually that dynasty loses the mandate of heaven and eventually just collapses. And so this up and down pattern was very much part of Confucian philosophy and Chinese history in general. A few of Confucius's students are Mencius and Xun Zi, right? And these were two of Confucius's students, and they provide an interesting contrast because they really wrestle with this question: is man good or evil? Right? Mencius said that mankind is naturally good, and so therefore government should encourage human goodness and in some ways stay out of people's way, whereas Xun Zi saw mankind as naturally bad, and so therefore government should correct man's evils and bad behaviors and really control humans. And so these two students, and Confucius had many important students throughout history, both men who worked with him directly and then people who researched him and studied him and learned from him. We would sometimes refer to them as students as well. But this central question is going to be very important in Chinese governance as the Qin dynasty gives way to the Han Dynasty. Also, sometime in the later Zhou dynasty or Warring States period, Taoism develops as well under a sort of mysterious figure known as Lao Zi. And we don't know much about Lao Zi. Most of the stories we have are somewhat fantastic, miraculous. When we read these stories of his mother being pregnant with him for 40 years, and when he's born, he already has white hair and is wise. Strange business. So we don't really know much about Lao Zi. He's just kind of known as the old teacher. But the focus of Taoism is a sense of harmony with nature. That the world, and when we say nature here, we're not just talking about trees and waters and mountains and things like that, but the natural way that humans are, the natural way that human life works out. A lot of Taoism is about accepting the way things are and just trying to put oneself in harmony with the way things are and just embrace it. And so while Confucianism is going to have a more political, governmental, social influence on China, Taoism will have more of a cultural influence, kind of shaping the way people think and feel. Okay, so out of the the end of the Warring States period, we get Shi Huangdi, and he is the king of the Qin state, although he would later go on to conquer the other states, and it's his conquest of those neighboring states that we saw in that map earlier in this lecture. It's his conquest of those states that helps to unify China under the Qin dynasty. And Shi Huangdi is an interesting character. He was a megalomaniac, and what we mean by that is total ego, total desire to control everything, somewhat bloodthirsty and very ruthless. Not the kind of guy that you want to get in his way. I mean, you want to think of somebody like Stalin or Hitler without the killing of minorities and without the real evil, but someone who is very much interested in absolute power, absolute control, complete dictator. But Shi Huangdi united people, and he ended a long-standing war. So sometimes, this shows us from world history, sometimes to create peace, you just have to be the nastiest guy on the block. And Shi Huangdi is certainly one of the nastiest guys in world history, but he united these warring states, he stopped the war, and he brought a lot of good things to China. He helped standardize coinage, right? So no matter where you went throughout the Qin lands, a penny was a penny was a penny, so to speak. Also standardized weights and measures so that it wasn't like in this part of the empire, a foot is 12 inches, and then in this part of the empire, a foot is 13.5 inches. He standardized all that, which allowed the country to experience a lot more unity and economic cooperation across very different regions. He also was responsible for the development of the Great Wall, which, parts of the Great Wall had already existed, but it's under Shi Huangdi's leadership that it's goes from being a lot of good walls to a great wall. His tomb contains, the very famous clay army, every statue is, thousands of clay statues, and they're all unique. They all look different. Again, he centralized a lot of the culture, centralized a lot of the government for China, which created a lot of stability and order. However, his government was also responsible for burning books that he found objectionable, threatening, offensive, possibly undermining his rulership. And so Shi Huangdi, a very complicated figure. I think it's very difficult to say whether he was a good guy or a bad guy. A common activity in some world history classes is to put the man on trial, which that trial can sometimes go either way. But Shi Huangdi led the ascendancy of Qin and the Qin dynasty, which was very, very short-lived. And there were some key factors that led to the success of the Qin dynasty, and some characteristics that would really set the model for later Chinese dynasties. Remember, we're looking at the classical period, and part of why this is the classical period is because certain patterns are set up in Europe with Rome, or Mesoamerica with the Olmecs and the Mayans, or here in China. Right? These patterns are set up, and they will be repeated many times throughout history. And so part of what made Qin so successful was that their peasants were very free. They kind of let the workers work the land and, for the most part, do what they wanted to do. No slavery here, or no, really forced servitude. Very low taxes. Again, for the most part, the dynasty kind of let people alone and let them do their own thing. The Qin had a background as nomads, right? They're the descendants of the Zhong, the feared Xiongnu. So these were really tough people. And able to endure a lot of hardship and to work very hard. And, as is so often the case in Chinese history and world history in general, they had very strong STEM, great technology. And so iron weapons, the crossbow, and advanced military strategies really allowed the Qin to conquer. And again, the Qin bring about this highly centralized government, and that's one of the major themes in Chinese history, is a very continuous government, right? We looked at the mandate of heaven. We looked at the rise and fall of emperors and dynasties, and we're going to look at that a lot in this course. But going throughout Chinese history, while the dynasties come and go, that Chinese government is kind of always there. And that empire is kind of always there. And that's because of the scholar gentry and the bureaucracy, the workers of the government, right? So an emperor might die, but those bureaucrats stay there, and they continue to control the taxes, the building of roads, the building of canals, education. And then a new emperor comes in and wants to change everything, but those bureaucrats kind of keep everything stable. And so that stable central government is one of the key factors to Chinese success in world history. As we then shift from the Qin to the Han, we see another key pattern in Chinese history. China will go through this pattern of having warrior emperors for, a couple emperors in a row, maybe a dynasty, and then it'll kind of shift to the more enlightened emperors who are, much more in tune with Confucian thought and education and economics. And so we're going to see this back and forth throughout Chinese history in this course of, the warrior periods and the enlightened scholar periods. And so out of the death of Shi Huangdi and the very rapid breakdown of the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty comes. And and that is really an interesting story, right? The first Han emperor is a man by the name of Liu Bang, who was born a peasant. And through military genius and local leadership, he eventually gathered people around him who, were good soldiers, good warriors, and he was able to unite China again very, very quickly. Remember, we had this warring states period for centuries, just bloody, fights, and Shi Huangdi pulls everything together, and then he dies and things crack very quickly, but the Han pull it together, and part of that's because of Shi Huangdi's legacy, right? He left good infrastructure, good roads, good canals. He left a good system of currency, right? A good system of money. He left these really good defensive fortifications, so China didn't have to really worry about invaders from the north. And so the Han Dynasty rose very quickly. It's probably the fastest changeover in Chinese history. And again, it's because of Shi Huangdi's legacy. And, the Han Dynasty, kind of like Rome, was a very imperialistic dynasty, very much about pushing outwards and conquering new lands and conquering new people. And it's under the Han that Chinese culture will be pushed outwards, right? The Han will subjugate, right? They'll conquer the Huns to the north, right? Who are the descendants of the Xiongnu, the nomads to the north, the peoples of the Korean Peninsula, the peoples of Vietnam, and the Thai peoples, who will be pushed to the south and west into what is will later become Thailand. And so one of the things that we're doing with this project is comparing and contrasting civilizations. Han imperialism and Roman imperialism make a great comparison. We've also been looking at social mobility in this project, right? You know that social mobility describes how people can become richer and more powerful within a civilization. And for the Han Chinese, and indeed China in general, an interesting phenomenon has been the importance of merit. China has been much more willing to allow people to rise based on their intelligence and their hard work, as opposed to just who their parents are and whether or not they were born wealthy. And a lot of Chinese history shows us that social mobility is based on intellectual merit, right? Being a good student, getting a good education, moving up and passing the imperial exams and becoming a member of the scholar gentry. Traditionally in China, a scholar is a very noble thing. To be known as a scholar is a great honor, much more so than in Europe or other world civilizations. And so we want to keep that in mind, of how education was really the means to social mobility within Han China. Later on, when Han China starts to break down, that social mobility will break down and the educational system will break down as well. So, not only do we want to compare this to Rome, but we're going to ask about our own culture as well. Is our social mobility breaking down, and is our educational system breaking down, and is there a connection between those two? All right, so let's take a look at governmental technique within Han China. One of the things that China did really well was develop a system of client states. And a client state is an independent nation or an independent kingdom who, they have their own government, they have their own laws, their own control, but really everything they do is to serve the bigger neighbor or the bigger empire, the bigger kingdom next door. And that was one of the things that the Chinese did very, very successfully, especially to the north, right? China didn't want to have to fight the Xiongnu and the Huns, so they would recruit some of these nomadic tribes to live along their northern border and fight against the Han and the Xiongnu and really protect them. So that's, a client state and a trade state. Also, Chinese governmental technique, a lot of it was built on roads and canals. And from the Roman lecture how important roads are. Canals are as well, right? A canal is basically an artificial river dug by human beings. A canal is a road. It's just for boats instead of feet and wheels. And so, the Han Dynasty's governmental technique, again, based on these client states and then strong infrastructure similar to Rome. And so once again, out of this imperialism, out of this strong governmental technique of client states and good transportation infrastructure, Han China developed what we may call a sphere of influence, right? A big circle where China influenced these other countries, other kingdoms, and really spread Chinese culture. And we see that even today, the influence of the Chinese language on Korean and Japanese and Vietnamese, as well as the genetic influence of China on those areas, right? And so Han China diffuses, right? Diffuse is diffusion. It's a fancy word for spreading out, right? Han China diffuses its culture into these regions in ways that still characterize that part of the world today. Right? Han China's economic character was based mainly on strong agricultural surpluses. Right? China has extremely fertile farmlands with very good availability of fresh water, and so China historically has been able to raise some fantastic crops. It had a very limited import trade, right? We know from watching the Rome lecture that Rome was hungry, right? There's constantly imports going into Rome, again, similar to the modern United States. China, not so much. China really wasn't that interested in trading with other people. About the Silk Roads, and yeah, China was a part of the Silk Road trade, but very often for trade, China could kind of take it or leave it. Very often people would come to China, we want to trade, and China would kind of look at them. Chinese traders, the Chinese government would kind of look at these traders from other parts of the world and say, well, you don't really have anything we want. You don't really have anything we need. And so traditionally China was very insular, right? They didn't do a lot of business with the rest of the world. And when they did, it was primarily exports. And again, we're seeing those patterns again today. China, because of this insularity, because of these strong agricultural surpluses, and because of the influence of Confucian thought, China had a very harmonious economy. There was an upper class, right? There was an emperor, there were rich, powerful people, but they had a very solicitous attitude towards their peasants, right? They really cared about what the peasants thought. They really wanted the peasants to be happy and wanted peace within the empire. Very different from the Romans had no problem putting the squeeze on peasants and demanding things of the peasants. And indeed, most world civilizations have no problem pushing their peasants around. But I think because of this Confucian ideal, the emperors knew that in order to keep the mandate of heaven, they were going to have harmony with their peasants. And so we tend to see that, especially in periods when Chinese dynasties are very strong. China, of course, had a great literacy system. Chinese literacy is perhaps some of the most difficult to understand in the world, right? People often say English is the hardest language on earth. I'm not sure about that. Chinese is a very interesting language because these characters represent words and concepts, but they also represent sounds. And so to read Chinese, you have to be very aware of whether the word is representing an idea or a sound. Often very slight changes to the character can change the meaning very significantly. Of course, Chinese is a tonal language, so if the syllable sounds a little bit different, it can change the meaning of the word drastically. Right? If I say tomato or tomato in English, you know what I mean. But those kind of changes in Chinese can affect meaning very profoundly. And so you say tomato, I say tomato in Chinese. Doesn't quite work the way it does in English. China also had very, very powerful STEM capabilities, but while the Romans, and indeed many world civilizations, applied their STEM capabilities to military advancement, and China was no slouch in the military department, China spent a lot of time developing what we may call economic STEM. Things that would improve Chinese workers' productivity, things that would increase agricultural surpluses, things that would make China wealthier. And so as we look down the list here, you notice most of this is not for weapons. It's for, farming. It's for economic production. And that's a big story in Chinese history, and will contribute to the rise of China and the wealth of China, and later on will make China more vulnerable as more advanced military STEM civilizations begin to come into contact with China. But that's centuries from the period we're looking at right now. And so that huge STEM capability in economic area, those massive agricultural surpluses, really contributed to China's population. And I think this is a really interesting statistic that I found in reading up for this lecture, that traditionally, and indeed for most of world history, China has had 20% of the world's population. Right, so I think we're kind of used to thinking about China as being a highly populated part of the world. In this day and age, China has over 1 billion people. Yes, that's 1 billion. And so China has always been highly populated. And again, it goes back to that high agricultural and economic output to be able to support such a large civilization. All right, so let's shift gears now and start to look at some of the declines in Han China. Right, the things that led to the loss of the mandate of heaven. And the first was this ossification of the Chinese, of the Shi scholar gentry class, right? To ossify is to become hard like a stone, right? So China begins to lose this social mobility in this very fluid, dynamic society, and people begin to become locked in. Suddenly the peasants can't rise. The scholar gentry can't fall into being peasants. Everybody gets locked in, and that frustrates people, right? People want to become wealthier. People want to become more successful. I mean, not everyone, but a civilization has to have a way that allows people to become more successful, or else those people are going to become very frustrated and they will become violent. And so China's scholar gentry class ossifies. And there are a couple reasons that cause this, right? The first is the cost of preparing for those exams that would allow someone to become a scholar gentry. Titles that used to be earned through hard work and success become hereditary. They become passed on from father to son. And so this sense of meritocracy is gone. And with that, China begins to lose the mandate of heaven. The interactions during the time period also begin to contribute to China's decline, right? The Silk Road trades, especially as camels become more successful beasts of burden along the route, bring a lot of new ideas and different products into China, and that changes Chinese society. And also, as we saw with our Roman lecture, the Silk Roads were also a route for disease transmission. And so these all start to cause this crisis of political legitimacy. Also at this time period, a lot of the Chinese imperial government, right, the central government, became controlled by the eunuchs, right? And a eunuch is an interesting thing. A eunuch is a male without part of his stuff, right? And so the emperors had a lot of eunuchs because it was thought that a eunuch would not be ambitious, and a eunuch won't have a son ever. And so eunuchs made good government officials because they wouldn't try to overthrow the emperor and put their own sons in power. They would just be happy. But over time, the eunuchs became very politically powerful and indeed began to run the government. Also, the emperors had these large collections of concubines, right? A concubine is a woman who is kept for her beauty and attention, right? Some of these emperors had hundreds of concubines, literally a different concubine every night. And that was another reason these eunuchs were so important in the Chinese court, because, of course, the concubines are only there for the emperor. And, eunuchs tend not to be very interested in concubines, if you will. And so we get a real breakdown of the mandate of heaven in the Chinese government because the emperors are having too much fun. And as these emperors become less interested in governing, we start to get warlords in some of the outlying areas who break away. They say, we're not going to listen to the emperor. The emperor doesn't have any power out here. We have the power. Also, as these emperors became more interested in their own pleasures and in building fancy palaces and having fancy clothes and eating fancy food, um, they stopped investing money in roads and canals. Um, I mean, in some ways, the breakdown of the mandate of heaven is a moral breakdown. These emperors became immoral. They became sexually and economically greedy. They became greedy for food. They became lazy. They lost focus. And, that's part of the characteristic of the loss of the mandate of heaven. And one of the final events in the breakdown of the Han Dynasty was a series of religious revolts who were led by Taoists, the so-called Yellow Turbans, who had a kind of religious vision for renewing China and, really challenged the authority of the emperor. And so that's it. We've looked at the rise of the Han Dynasty, its significant achievements, and then its breakdown. And so remember to use your online study guide to help you study for the online quiz. Also, as you review this lecture in your study guide, use your SPICE graphic organizer as well. Thanks for watching.